All right, I'm calling this talk Reality 102. Why 102? Well, because I already had a talk I called Reality 101, and it's just not good to name two talks the same name. It makes people confused. So this is Reality 102. This is going to be a little different than what I normally do. Typically in these workshops, I start at the beginning and kind of derive what reality is all about, why it's that way. If you've looked at the Calgary workshop, or you've looked at the one that I did, the last one was in Marseille, that's up on YouTube, that's where you'll find really the theory of MBT. I'm not going to do that today. I have something else for you today. And if you find that you don't have the logical connections between things, because I'm not going to start in the beginning and derive everything. I'm going to start somewhere in the middle, and I won't be going through the details because I've done that over and over and over. It's out there, it's available. So anything I tell you that you say, oh, how did he get to that point? You know, did he just make that up? Well, I'm not making it up. There's really logic behind my points, and you can find that elsewhere, but you probably won't find it today. But you can ask the question either later on today or tomorrow if you have issues and things and you don't know how I got from A to B. So we'll have lots of time for Q&A tomorrow, and depending on how quickly I can get through these slides, there's about 60 of them that we're going to do today. We may have some Q&A for today. I hope so. Well, I'll give you just a very short background because most of you have probably heard that already too. I'm a physicist. I met Bob Monroe when I was in my late 20s. Bob was looking for scientists to work in his lab. I was a scientist, and I volunteered. And the deal was that he would teach me to do what he knew how to do, which, if you know Bob Monroe, that's journeys out of the body, far journeys, and yeah, what? Ultimate Journey, right, his three books. So he taught me how to get into this larger consciousness system and explore it and do that whenever I chose to do that under complete control. So I'm a physicist, and what physicists do is try to understand how reality works. Well, that was a big challenge to a physicist who was now, flying around in the larger reality as to how does this thing work? What are the limits? What can I do? What does it mean? What is consciousness anyway? And those were all hard questions, and I'm a little bit slow. So it was about 30, 35 years later that I wrote these books, and I'd been working on it pretty much all that time. The Monroe connection lasted a decade or so, probably 5 years that were really active all the time, and then as a board of directors for years after that. But anyway, I never let it go. Once you start down this path, most of you have found, you don't turn around and walk away from it. This is a path of becoming, a path of growing up. And once on it, you kind of take wherever it, you go wherever it takes you. So that's what I did. I kept working on it. And I knew, by the time I got to where I was writing the books, and the books took about 5 years to write, I understood consciousness, I thought, pretty well. I understood that this is a virtual reality. That means it's a computed reality. I understood that consciousness was the computer. I understood that in a social system that consciousness is, with all of us individuated units of consciousness, that's us, bouncing around in this larger consciousness system, that it's a social system, which led to the conclusion that to lower entropy, now I'm skipping steps here a little bit, but to lower entropy, that means for a information system, lowering entropy means evolving, existing, continuing. Randomness in an information system means no information. To an information system, that's death, disappearing, dissolving. Okay? So this system is just a natural system, and it wants to survive, it wants to evolve, it's aware, it's conscious. Well, it's consciousness. Of course it's conscious. It's intelligent. It's conscious. So in order to evolve, it has to lower entropy. And the lowest entropy state in a cooperative environment full of individuated unit of consciousness is if they cooperate, if they care about each other, they have compassion. That means that love is the point of our existence. Okay, so I knew all that. And I knew that that was a very important message to get across, that was kind of dramatic. Here we are. What's our purpose? Who are we? Why are we here? Well, we're here to grow up. We're here to lower the entropy of our consciousness. We're here to become love. And certainly the world needs that message. That's pretty obvious. We don't live in that world yet, that world of love. But we need to. Interesting enough, I didn't really realize what good physics, understanding consciousness, would create. I didn't understand that until about 2 years in. I published these books in 2003. And a couple of years after that, I got the idea, and I came to the conclusion that the same principles that explain consciousness explained physics. And I saw that my probabilistic model of consciousness was the perfect explanation for quantum mechanics and how the double slit experiment works. And the double slit experiment is like the quintessential quantum mechanics experiment. It's not that hard, and it shows you, has all the stuff of what's strange about quantum mechanics. It's all wrapped up in that one experiment. Matter of fact, quantum physicist Richard Feynman had said that the double slit experiment, if we understood that, all the rest, would be clear. That's the key thing. So when I realized that I understood that from the consciousness viewpoint, I started looking at other things. And it wasn't but a few months went by that I saw also that consciousness told me why c was a constant. Speed of light, c. It's another big mystery in science. And then I started looking for other things, and I started finding that the paradigm, the paradoxes in science, physics has a lot of paradoxes, things it just doesn't understand. They have experiments that give them data, but they just don't know why it's like that. That consciousness was explaining all of these paradoxes, one after the other after the other. And the very last thing that I've added to the list is chaos theory. I read a book about chaos, and the author wrote in this book, he said that scientists and science historians have made the comment that the 20th century would be known for three things, three big things that science accomplished or that science discovered in the 20th century. Quantum mechanics, relativity, and chaos. Well, consciousness had explained quantum mechanics, then explained relativity with the speed of light being constant. So I thought, chaos, let me think about that for a minute, and it also explains that. There's a very rational, I'll get to that toward the end of the talk. I'll explain a little bit about why our reality is chaotic. Now, I don't mean chaos in the terms of what you see on the street. I mean chaos in the terms of more like physics, in the terms of the way systems work and systems move. We find a lot of natural systems are naturally chaotic if you push them into areas that are unstable. So that became in the 1990s, I guess. Original work maybe goes all the way back to the 70s, but it really became a big thing in the 1990s. It's the last kind of big idea that we had about the nature of reality. Fundamentally, it's chaotic. It's not buttoned down like we thought or like we pretend. So we'll talk about that. So the point was, how was I going to deliver this message of love to the larger population? And it occurred to me that the key, of course, is virtual reality. That was my key. Once I understood that this was a virtual reality and it was all information-based, everything else, all the rest of the dominoes, were in line, they all toppled over, and everything made sense. So virtual reality, understanding that is the key thing, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. And as Ellie told us, the scientists seem to just not get that. They had an experiment back in the early 1920s, almost 100 years ago, that told them that reality was not materialistic. Told them it was probabilistic. It told them that consciousness was involved because certain things happened when there was an observer that didn't happen if there wasn't an observer. So they had this information, but they didn't know what to do with it. So mostly they ignored it and pretended that it didn't exist, called it weird science, and went on. Okay? So that, to me, this double slit experiment was what I call a minor miracle, right? A miracle is something that happens that shouldn't, something you can't explain. It's a thing that is beyond your explanation. Well, the double slit experiment was a minor miracle because it just shouldn't happen. The double slit experiment says that if you fire particles one at a time at two holes in a background, those particles won't just pile up behind each hole, they will distribute themselves in a wave pattern. It's called a diffraction pattern. For some reason, they'll go through this hole and then find some place on the screen they hit that's a diffraction pattern. Well, that to me is sort of a miracle. You can't explain that. But it's a minor miracle because the particles are little. They're so tiny that scientists could say, well, they're so small we can't see them, so we don't really know the mechanism there. It's just weird science. It was easier to brush off. So what we needed was a major miracle. Even a couple of major miracles would be better. We needed something that showed these same things about virtual reality, but with hard chunks of matter that you could hold in your hand and look at, right? Things that you could do that would demonstrate that this was indeed a virtual reality and that it indeed was information-based and that consciousness is indeed the computer. So I started looking for those. And this is probably about a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, and I came up with a few, but the time wasn't right yet. Because when I started this in the early 2000s, 2003, me and maybe 5 other people on the planet thought virtual reality was a good idea. Everybody else thought it was silly. Now, 13 years later, virtual reality is taken very seriously. And most of that happened just in the last 5 years. It went from silly to this is the answer. And physicists didn't come there easily. They got drugged there, kicking and screaming, by the results of their own experiments. That's how they got there. And the younger crowd that wasn't quite as dedicated to the old way of looking at things started saying, yeah, this looks like a virtual reality. It's information-based. But that's as far as they got. It's like, well, okay, so what's the next step? And there was no next step because they didn't have any fundamental theory in which to put that into some kind of context where it made any sense. It seemed to be another piece of strange physics. It was there, but didn't make any sense. Well, I think we've got to the point now that there's enough support behind virtual reality that people will take concepts of virtual reality seriously. So it's time for me to talk about these experiments because I wanted to wait until at least there was a good chance that people would say, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, virtual reality. Let's try these and see how they work, which 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. It would have been virtual reality experiments. Go away. Don't waste my time. But this is a different world now, just in the past 5 years. So what I'm going to show you today, by the time we get to the end of this, I'm going to show you 3 major miracles. I'm going to show you experiments that will be impossible to do without a miracle. They're impossible to do under the understanding of materialism. And they're not tiny little particles. They're things you can hold in your hand. These are macro things that you can hold in your hand. So if they work the way I think they will work, then it will be a very big deal. Now, why this is important is not so much the physics. The physics is just the lever. It's the lever to pry the ball out of its rut and to get it rolling. Because you see, the first step in getting there is to get the physicist on board. And as you've heard me term the scientists today, the new high priests of Western culture, and Western culture now is world culture. It's pretty well spread everywhere. That was the culture that Ellie was telling us about that looks the other way and doesn't have the answers. Okay. So the scientists are the new high priests. They tell us what to believe. They tell us what is truth and what is false. They tell us what is superstition and what is fact. That's the role that scientists have, and they have their scientific method to do that. You see? So without the scientists standing up and saying, this is a virtual reality and here's how it works, virtual reality ideas will always be in the margins. They'll never be mainstream. And without the understanding of virtual reality, there's no understanding that consciousness is the computer. Without that understanding that consciousness is computer, you don't end up with love is the answer. Because only when you understand the nature of consciousness do you see that we are here to evolve and that love is the answer. So if we really want this idea that love is the answer to spread and be seen by the masses, then we start with the physicists. That's the lever that will get the ball rolling. Seems odd, doesn't it, that you start with physicists, the group that is probably the furthest away and deepest in denial, about this, but that's the group you have to start with to get this ball rolling. Otherwise, the ball just wobbles around in the margins and it'll stay there. It's been in the margins, since Buddha said our reality is an illusion. Well, he was right on, but it didn't really cause much to happen other than in the margins. So that's where we are. So these physics experiments, hopefully, will be miracle enough to get the scientists interested in proving them wrong and doing them and hopefully showing that it actually works that way. So what I've done is I've taken a concept of virtual reality, how that virtual reality applies to our reality, how our reality is created from this virtual reality, and taken those concepts and just applied them to quantum mechanics. Okay, so how would the larger consciousness system run this reality? How do they implement it? How does it work? And one of the last big ideas that I had there, that kind of was the last chink in the logical process, I actually had here in California, in Southern California, just probably 50 miles south. I think it was Costa Mesa, where I did a workshop, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? I don't know. It was a long time. 8 years ago. Okay, 8 years ago. And when I was there talking, I had answered some questions and was having a little conversation later with my son, who lives in that neighborhood, and he attended it, and he said, well, don't you think I was mentioning things that the probability, the most likely thing was chosen. What was most likely was the thing that was chosen because we had all the likelihoods. And he said, well, wouldn't that better if it was random? And I thought, well, yeah, it's sort of what I meant, but because of the way the randomness works out, you end up most of the time with what's most likely. But that got me thinking about more definition to the structure. And from that point forward, it all went very quickly to where I understood the mechanism of how this reality operates. And it's that understanding that is going to produce these experiments. Now, these are just experiments, so we don't know how they're going to work out yet. We don't know what the result's going to be. virtual reality, my concept of virtual reality and how it works is what leads to them. Whether that actually turns out to be correct, you have to wait till the experiments to be done. If it's not correct, well, the ideas about consciousness and about love is the answer, and that this is a virtual reality still are good. Doesn't throw those out. It would just mean that my understanding of how that virtual reality implements, the mechanics of how that implements this reality, were wrong. Okay? So that's what we're going to do today. Hopefully, this will be the kickoff to a major sea-state change in the thinking of science about virtual reality and consciousness. So that's what we're here to do today. And for those of you who are mostly right-brained and deal with big pictures in the whole world, I'll apologize ahead of time. This is going to be mostly technical. It's going to be on a level that everybody can understand. I'm not going to talk physics speak, but it's going to be long, and it's going to be about virtual reality and science and physics. And hopefully you'll find it interesting, because I think it'll help you see how the bigger picture is put together. But if it's really too painful, I hope you brought your Excedrin with you, and particularly Marla. Last time I talked to Marla, she was in that group that I talked about down in Costa Mesa, and she came up to me about 2/3 of the way through, and she says, "Tom, you have given me the worst headache." Says, "I'm trying to get my mind around all of these things, and it's just, you know, my brain's going to explode."
But I'm still here.
And she's still here, came back for more. So that's kind of what we're doing, why we're here, and what we're going to talk about. The neat thing here is that this progression from virtual reality to consciousness to computer to love is the answer is not steps that take any leaps. No leaps in logic, no leaps of faith. Once you get virtual reality, consciousness computer is just a logical deduction. And once you get consciousness system is the most fundamental system and kind of behind it all, then the idea that love is the answer is just logical deduction. It's just not that hard to get there. So if we get this first step, you see, those other steps will be resisted mightily, but they're so obvious that they will fall, I think, rather quickly. So anyway, that's what we're doing. This may be something that will make a big difference. We hope so.